Good evening, everyone. I thought we'll wait for 2 more minutes, but then I realized my introduction is quite long, so I thought it will account for the wait. A lot of familiar faces from the past two, I mean, the workshop that's been happening from yesterday and today. A lot of new faces, exciting. Uh, I'm Gokul Prabhu. I look after the public engagement programs at Archives at NCBS. And it is a pleasure to welcome you all for the 73rd edition of Archives Public Lecture Series. For those of you who may have been to Archives or to NCBS, you're already quite aware of what we do at Archives. For those of you who are new, the Archives at NCBS is a public collecting center for history of science in contemporary India. So we have close to 400,000 materials, process papers, photographs, scientific equipments, and audio recordings, and so on. We're located in the basement of this building where we are. You just take the lift after this hall, and then in the basement is where you'll find us. We'd love to host you. Please visit us, and we are also accessible online. So you search for Archives at NCBS, and the first website that pops in, search for catalog, and then you'll be able to see most of our materials digitized. So the public lecture series brings together individuals whose work opens up new ways of thinking about archives and the history of ideas. Over the years, we've hosted artists, archivists, academicians, lawyers, teachers, journalists, and many others whose work intersects with records, memory, and knowledge making. It is my pleasure to be introducing and welcoming Senthil Babu this fine evening. Senthil is a historian of mathematics based at the French Institute of Pondicherry. His work examines knowledge practices within political economies with particular attention to how abstraction, labor, and social life intersect. He's the author of the book Mathematics and Society, Numbers and Measures in Early Modern South India, and he's currently involved in building initiatives that document and archive computational practices in South India. Over the past 2 days, Babu has been part of the workshop hosted by the Archives at NCBS that concluded earlier today. Through the sessions and in the many conversations that continued beyond them, we have had the chance to experience the depth of his engagement with his subject. There is a rare combination of rigor and curiosity in the way he speaks about his work, along with the generosity in sharing the stories that emerge from it. We're glad that the workshop now extends into this public lecture. Today's talk is titled Between the Concrete and the Abstract Computational Work in South India. In this lecture, Senthil invites us to reflect on how measures, metrics, and calculations shape social life, not only in the present, but historically as well. Drawing on examples from medieval and colonial periods, he traces how computational work moved from the concrete and the abstract, from classrooms where arithmetic was learned through recollective practices, to occupations such as revenue accounting, where numbers carried significant political consequences. Through these histories, he encourages us to look more closely at how abstraction operates in everyday life. After this lecture, we'll open the floor for questions and discussion, and it'll be followed by tea and snacks. So we hope you all stay back and continue the conversation. With that, Babu, over to you.
Thank you, Gokul. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So thanks for the Ubaid Siddiqui chair, good friend Samira, Venkat, Gokul, Ravi, Nikita, and everyone who is making this wonderful thing here, and for inviting people like us to share our own work. So thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for NCBS. For some of you who have been here for the last 2 days, there is part of it which might seem too much of talking, carrying on from yesterday, but there is a part of it which I also wanted to invite your attention to kind of probe deeper into some other questions. So to begin with, this particular focus on the changing relationship between measure, calculation, and value making, or valuation as it is called, struck very deeply a couple of years ago in a village called Periyavillai in Kanyakumari district. There's a very good friend of us who is a deep sea fisher called Dixon. He narrated to us the story. We are trying to see, there was this cyclone called Oki in 2018. So it's one of those rare cyclones which changed its course within a span of 18 hours. Nobody thought West Coast doesn't get that much of a cyclone as the East Coast does, and it's one of those rare cyclones. And then it came and swept everything which was in the sea. It hardly came to the landward side. It moved into the deep sea, and there was not enough time to warn the fishes who were already in the deep sea about the cyclone, who were not being told. And it pointed to us what is the kind of communication which is a two-way communication between the deep sea fisher and the people who are on the land. You got all kinds of apparatus imaginable and necessary for cargo ships, yeah, but not for our fishers. So, but the government would always say, oh, they can use ham, they can use radio, but they are resisting it. You know, there's a long thing between the possibility of establishing a two-way communication for rescue and safety of fishers. So Dixon told us this story. We are trying to go and talk to our friends about what is the way that we can negotiate with the government for rescue, safety, and protection of deep sea fishes. So during the Oki cyclone, people could not be warned, lots of loss of lives who were in the sea. There was a huge rescue operation by the Indian Navy, in charge by the finance minister, who was physically there. And there's this strange, so after 2 days, so they approached the Navy and said, look, you are all searching for our people in the wrong places in the sea. We know where our brothers and cousins are fishing, so please take us into a helicopter and let's come with you, and we know, let's go. But the Navy says, no, the protocol does not allow for taking a civilian into the army helicopter. So, 3 days later, 4 days later, people are getting desperate, and then there are stories of, people are taking their own ships and going into the deep sea, doing their own rescue operations. And so hearing this, Dixon approaches the social media that, there is this thing and there's a pressure. And then a Coast Guard ship with a captain who is from Madras. He says, come, let's go, follow your directions, and then takes the thing. They go to Thoothukudi port, get into the Coast Guard ship, and then so they, very nice, friendly captain. They keep talking, and they say, no, you guys rest. We will follow the lat-long coordinates that you give us, and then we'll go to the direction and so on. So next morning, Dixon gets up, and then he says, no, this is not the sea where we are supposed to go. This is the very familiar sea where we are, where we started from. And then he goes and confronts the captain saying, look, you are not taking us to the place where you meant us to take. And then captain says, yeah, you are very smart, you figured it out. But to be very honest with you, the law, if a fisherman loses life, probably the government will announce a compensation of 1 lakh rupees, yeah? But the search operation that you are asking us to go on, you have no idea how much it would cost, yeah? So he goes around, so he was literally 10 miles away from the Thoothukudi port, doing a circling operation around the thing, and took them back to the Thoothukudi port. And so when Dixon was narrating the story, he asked this question, so how much is the fisher's life worth it? So he also asked, but then I thought we are contributing to the GDP, we are contributing to the economy, but what is this 1 lakh as a value of a fisher's life, whereas the effort, the fish that we catch, contributes to the GDP. So he raised this question, and then it kind of pointed to us, what is planning, what is fiscal budgeting, what is rule making to spend the money that you make for, and what kind of calculations go into the value that you think is important for someone, and so on. And then we started consciously looking at, thanks to the very striking question that Dixon raised, and then try to explore the connection much more historically into thing, and then see one of the important devices for calculating the value of people's lives or labor or the place that they live in is brought us to the attention of various kind of things that overrule our contemporary lives very mostly, which is the rule of metrics. They have always been around, they have been very pertinent, they are pervasive, but something about our lives today where it rules over us in a way that which has not been there before. And therefore, it invites us to probe more deeply into the question of who measures to produce what value, and then what gets measured and how the valuation happens. And so we thought one of the way to dwell into this world of the production of metrics is something like index making. You know, the indexical production of work, it's like a routine occupation. You produce indices, they are very consequential. They can be exercises in abstraction, you know, they produce thing. And something about indexical thing, it's like very, you know, the common sense way of, intuitive way of understanding indexes, it's a guide, right? It's not something real. It's like the index finger showing us something, guiding us something, but it's not real. Yeah, so you need to actually walk in order to find the destination. So there are lots and lots of indices that's produced. You know, index for food and nutrition. If you've not watched this video, it's very, very, very educative. Please watch John Dre's talking about what goes into the minimum wage basket if the public distribution system in India assures for nutrition in order to determine the minimum wage for every day. There is a index for public health, you know, lots and lots of variables which gets refined every day. We all know about, you know, from the poverty index to move into the multidimensional poverty index, we took about 4 decades, yeah. So this is something that we are all familiar with, you know, the index for credit, or how much credit worthy you are, you know, the bank forces you to know your CIBIL score kind of thing. But there is a complete different industry of credit worthiness calculations. So this company called CRIF IMARC, which is an aggregator agency, which supplies and sells its data, and they very proudly announce on their website that we will not leave any single working woman in India unmeasured. You know, that's like the thing. It sounds almost like Colonel Lambton saying, we will not leave any single square feet of India unmeasured by the great trigonometrical survey, right? So you have this kind of, you know, announcements, and the kind of variables that they choose, that the repayment, the possibility of repayment creates the index for efficiency, and then it gets built into it, and then, you know, you include more and more. So refining the system, you know, allows for more and more variables. So you can keep refining the system, like modeling, and then this kind of very obsessive self-spiraling quest for objectivity seems to have a tendency to erase fundamental needs and leave them behind, unless they could be parameterized or, you know, brought into the index in some way or other. And but there are also things like, you know, what is the index for honor, right? So when you know, the trespassing histories, or what is the index for honor? You know, it's the value of life that gets killed. I mean, if you fall in love. And there is also, you know, lots and lots of studies about, you know, what is the index for love, you know, swiping left, swiping right, how many people are doing it, what, and there is a whole formula that goes into calculating thing. And we are all familiar with the story of, you know, what makes you a citizen of this country, you know, and the rule making that allows for claiming citizenship. We also have happiness index, yeah, so we have, you know, this is the factors of gross national happiness as it is thing. And the most and the least happy countries in the world, that's we discovered recently while looking for the happiness index. There is also a rule of law index, which is, you know, the top 3 being the Scandinavians. And so it points to how somehow, in order to be valued, something needs to be measured, and what gets measured. So in fact, 2 years ago, all the United Nations developmental organizations, the FAO, UNDP, UNEP, and all of them came together, and their motto, you know, it's like the slogan, it's like, what gets measured gets done. That's the shift in the international development institutional policy. That kind of captured our imagination. So therefore, we thought we need to kind of distinguish the 3 discrete stages in the process of valuation, which is to measure, and then to calculate, and then to make value. So there is this thing, some mathematician in front of mine tell me, yeah, but to measure is to calculate, right? Why are you distinguishing the 2? And somewhere we thought, we all understand how arbitrary measures can be, and then, you know, we yield it over to the not to the box where calculation happens, and then somehow we don't subject it to scrutiny as much as we should be doing, and then we finally accept the value for what it is when it is thrown at us, either in terms of wages, either in terms of amount of rice in the PDS, or so we just accept it, and when the world is inundated with this regimes of calculation that keeps reproducing the values that we accept, and there is a lot of labor that goes into the making of the thing, which I think the contemporary university is facing a lot of challenges to keep producing this labor, which has to produce these indices, measures, and this thing. But there is also there seems to be a tendency, and we delegate the job of value making to others quite easily, and by doing that, and therefore by not subjecting this thing to more collective social political scrutiny, then are we becoming more and more complicit to the is a question that also came to us, and I'm just sharing this question, something for us to think together about. But there are also things which cannot be measured seemingly. It's like what is the measure of dignity in a caste society? In the 1930s and 40s, in the Kaveri Delta, in the coastal areas, if you put a towel on your shoulder, you could get killed, as a mark of this thing. Today we all know what are the different ways of this thing. So what is dignity? To be humiliated in a bus as a fisherwoman carrying a basket of fish and not being allowed to get into the fish, who wants to come the fish to a doorstep and deliver it to you, provide for your nutrition, but the public transport wouldn't let her because she is smelly, or what is the measure for dignity? But then there is also a tradition of refusing to get measured. But more and more, there is this thing about, who can afford to say, look, I will not be measured. There is this growing kind of a divide in us as to know who can refuse, who can afford to refuse to be measured. And we thought one way to understand this would be to, to go through a longue durée thing and then identify some of the spaces where measure, calculation, value converge together in particular occupations. And we wanted to trace the story, and some of it which I shared yesterday is through the figure of occupation of revenue accounting, which if most of you have not read our friend Bhavani Raman's book. She is the one who has invited our attention to the occupation of revenue accounting and what kind of consequences it has, both for the state as well as for the people. And drawing upon her work, so as for the history of mathematics itself, we also wanted to kind of depart from the usual canonical ideas of what makes mathematics history is the the individual genius like Aryabhatta, Bhaskara, and Srinivasa Ramanujan, producing brilliant mathematical ideas, to more and more consequential mathematical practices. In that case, can we look back at the same texts that the other scholar is studying in order to read those texts as records of practices of those people and look at it as a medium, a medium that is facilitating a constant traffic between the concrete and the abstract, both at the school and at the workplace. And so first to kind of, for those of you who were not there yesterday, I will not spend much time. We talked about this in detail. So this medieval revenue accounting was, with the measuring rod, and then there is calculation types such as Madako. I will tell you briefly about what it is. Made possibility for an empire, which opposed to the conventional notions of empires as territorially vast and expansive, we wanted to look at empires as digging deeper and conquering one's own people through extracting their own labor. And we find three distinct elements that changed during the medieval South Indian history is the reordering of the ritual hierarchical order by allowing for Brahmadeyas. Brahmadeyas are exclusive Brahmin settlements, and you can see that they're always in the most fertile areas, and they occupy by physical geography wise, they occupy the core deltaic area. By 12th century, we get a complete spatial order has emerged. And one of the ways of arranging the spatial order is by instituting for the square grid pattern of reorganizing the land. And thanks to human geographers from Germany who came in the 80s, like Bohl and Nitz, who alerted to us that there is this relationship between settlement patterns and land organization, and then how are we supposed to look at it more critically. And we see it as a regimes of political control of labor. There is a symptoms of segregation of space that's coming up, and land gets measured and quantified in geometrical square grid plots, which operates like this and allows for a computational apparatus where you can fold the quantity of the land, the area, and then into the quality of the land in terms of soil fertility or access to water or something, and you commensurate both into create an index, and then for the purpose of tax calculations, even though the land has to be measured in terms of physical measuring instruments which are put in public display, where the measuring rod is on public display, anticipating its violation or anticipating a dispute arbitration, but then a verifiable kind of a mechanism where, but what is not so transparent and not so verifiable seemingly is the instruments such as Madaku calculation, which is Madaku in Tamil is folding, which is you are folding the real extent of the land notionally by shrinking it for the purpose of taxation onto the register. So this constant activity of the revenue accounting process where you abstract the real, make a notional unit, shrink it or expand it in the way you want, and then create a hierarchy of values. For in this case, for instance, we have, for a typical example of the Madaka inscription, you have, this is the unit of land, which after going through the Madaku means it reduces to 1 by 20 plus 1 by 80. It's like there is a scaling ratio which is not very clear. What is the grade, what is the norms in which this ratio was built is not very clear, but we know that this became a major subject of discontent for most of the tenant cultivators who were supposed to pay most part of the revenue and share it with the Brahmin landlords, which are the new landlords, and with the king and the temple. And this constant necessity for proportioning areas of land and to commensurate them with, with concrete quantities of grain created this notional notes of calculation, which was very obvious only to the accounting and not so transparent to others. And these are dictated, of course, by the necessities of political control. And this kind of told us then what is concrete in the world of the political and what is concrete about computation itself. If, this is all very concrete, as we all know, can't be more concrete than this, but then at the proportioning of the produce itself, these are also concrete, right? The grain as tax, the grain as wage, the grain as gift to the temple, and as grain also is producing the notional values of perpetuity claims, forever, as long as the sun and the moon's loss is the kind of perpetuity that everyone who is participating in that economy is. So this demanded this constant demand between the concrete and the abstract. Also kept the job of everyday calculation and thing in order to maintain a status quo. And so is it therefore that calculations such as the Madaku phenomena, or hierarchies abstract, but then whereas the notional values which are produced by very concrete labor, such as compulsory and slavery, which was very much integral to the system, how do we kind of, so how do we understand this flow between what is concrete and what's abstract? And this is around the time then we find that at least in the Tamil speaking region about the medieval South Indian thing, numbers were derived out of measures, and then measures remained as numbers into the thing. And this also continues well into the 14th and the 15th centuries during the Vijayanagara Empire. Just to kind of, I read out the inscription yesterday, but for the benefit of others, the kind of taxation regimes that continued, which created sometime in the medieval and consolidated by the Cholas, continues into the landscape and spreads across into various other parts of the thing. And then there is the ratio in which the proportioning and of entitlements from the land and the proportioning of taxation for everything that exists on land is very clearly demarcated. So this is in Tamil. So this is, for instance, the rice that's grown up in, the rice that's cultivated by the picota, the rice cultivated at the tail end, the various kinds of land, various kinds of rice that produced in various types of land. And then you have, the trees planted along the canals, the areca, the trees that is close to the river, and otherwise there is the the coconut, which yields more than 40 coconuts, in a season, how much needs to be taxed and how it not be taxed. There is jackfruit, there is betel nut, there is plantain, sugar cane, there is jasmines, other kinds of flowers like the ginger, pumpkins, castor, millets, various kinds of millets, and so everything that's imaginable, not a one single thing is left out of the tax register. And you also find various kinds of artisanal work and labor. So weavers are taxed on the loom, on what kind of loom do they have. The shepherds are taxed. The blacksmith, the goldsmith, the carpenter, the potter, the barber, the washerman, the oil merchant, the fisher, and the pariah, everyone in terms of the proportion. This constant revisioning of the proportions of entitlements into taxable units also comes into the early modern world, where at the threshing floor, the measuring instrument then. So there is a lot of legendary stories if you go into the delta that people say, as the measure of, if you take the vessel and measure at the threshing floor and distribute them as wages, there is something called, economic anthropologists have this interesting thing called the grain heap. I don't know if you're familiar. So it's like, so the heap is supposed to represent some kind of a generosity. Yeah, it's like the landlord willingly giving, yeah, like heap it up and then give, rather than shaving of the heap. Yeah. So there is a very sharp difference between the way you take the rice from the mound, and then as you put it into the basket, you just shave it off like that. So there is, so this the sudden shift in the way, what delivers fairness and transparency or objectivity, and therefore delivery of justice at the point of exchange through the measuring instrument, what it delivers ultimately is always negotiated and then subject to manipulation, other things. So what does the measuring instrument mean in the process is also the question that we are trying to. So if wages are simultaneously all these kinds of these things, then where do you place the measuring instrument at the site of exchange? And this distribution of hierarchies through the proportioning of entitlements, which is the constant job of the revenue accountant, continues well into the 18th century, thanks to the British East India Company, which sent this young engineer Thomas Bernard, who these are all village revenue accounts which are stored in Tanjavur Tamil University, and so each bundle has about 10 to 12 village accounts into the thing, written in palm leaves, and where you get a very detailed account of this proportioning of entitlements in terms of the division of produce at the threshing floor and the extent of the land. So it gives you a sense of what is the routine job of the revenue accountant, what was it doing for every cropping season. And so the routine job seems to be, is measuring the area, like for every cropping season or annually, is measuring the produce, calculating the tax, is allocating the proportions, and then therefore, most importantly, towards the 18th century, the constant job of monetizing the value of the grain in terms of this thing, which becomes a major challenge for the East India Company, because when they were trying to institute their own surveys, this is something that they could not handle, So whether do you historically average the prices in the local market, or how far the market goes, how do you average the prices of the grain in order to monetize the value of the grain locally? This is something that they think. So it kind of led to interesting debates about standardization of, so instead of standardizing the market or regulating it, they started standardizing the weights and measures, this thing. So there is this interesting story from about 1798, they appointed a committee to standardize weights and measures in Madras, which went on till 1846, 1845. The committee is falling apart, they're reconstituting it, they're deliberating the huge archive which is built, the proceedings of the committee for the standardization of weights and measures in Madras Presidency. Every 5 years, some British East India Company officer writing a huge treatise on weights and measures and what is the necessity of standards. Somebody saying it's very bad for commerce, I take the salt to Masulipatam port, they're measuring it, you say a different thing, but I sell it in the Madras port, they're measuring it differently. How are you supposed to do commerce in this country? Yeah, so let's standardize the instrument of measure. So that's the kind of the problems that they are facing. But then the idea of, this locally diverse measures and what does it do for the necessity of, producing a standard which is either for commerce or as instruments of political control, goes all the way to London. And so the district collectors are sent a circular saying, okay, they first send a table of existing weights and measures, which is like runs up to pages, and then the headquarters in London says, okay, I can't make head or tail out of it. Now you guys send me the physical samples. So the one district collector from Madurai, he writes saying, oh, that's funny that you ask for physical samples, because if you ask for physical samples, it will be bamboo sticks and stones. What are you going to do with this in London? The company says, no, send them anyway. So, there's a shipload of bamboo sticks and stones which reaches London. And then they appoint a very famous contemporary instrument maker in London called Bates and Company, and who is very well known for initially for making scientific instruments in those this thing. So they are given a contract, and the Bates and Company is supposed to commensurate these bamboo sticks and stones and produce brass molds, which then became the standards to be sent back to India. And then there is long 5 years of debate between where to keep the standards, the brass molds, in the customs office, in the local police station, where do you keep it? How do you make people comply to these standards? But then, more and more committees form, the instruments go here and back and forth, and but standardization is never complete, right? So the local diversity, people are, happily doing their, following their local measures. So this story kind of tells us this necessity of a standard as imagined by someone. What does it do for different people? What happens to the standard at the site of exchange as it is imagined, or at the site of practice? So the East India Company, even though it reimagined this whole necessity of standardization, created a different regime of surveys and settlements, there is a new computational demand, as it's no longer the proportioning of produce at the threshing floor, which the revenue accountant was doing, but he is supposed to become much more precise and fold in a lot of qualities of the land, such as irrigation, fertility, and seasonality, and so on, fold it into registers, and then what is called the new assessment exercise. And this demanded a different set of skills for the revenue accountant, and these are marked by what Barney has pointed out to us is the coming in of the paper. There is a new system of numerals. It's no longer the Tamil numeral system. You have to use the new numbers, and there is a lot of conversion that goes on. This lot of conversion also meant that all the arithmetic textbooks starting from the 1870s onwards meant that the teaching and learning of arithmetic followed the conversion of weights and measures into the thing. And I want to show you the power that the village accountant continued to hold. Yeah, so that's the accountant who is saying that Tangalan, the person who is saying that he's by the Rayatwari system is supposed to pay either 80 measures of rice, the kalam, which is the unit, or 100 the equivalent amount of pagodas. But if converted to the British system, it becomes exponentially higher. So that's the thing, and there is a whole thing. So please do watch the film Tangalan. I think in recent times it's made by P. Ranjit, and it talks about in very, very distinct ways. So then we wanted to ask, so where does this proficiency and the authenticity of the accountant's thing, I mean, where does it come from? And therefore, it became important for us to look at, the sites of training and what makes that kind of proficiency come. And for us, so we call the NCBS, the Tamil number primer, which produces this proficiency as the calculating engine. And if you look at it more closely, the NCBS, which is literally the N is number, SUVADI is the text, and the number text, the number primer, as we want to imagine, is facilitating this kind of a very machinic kind of an order, which made possible the learning of measures as numbers and so on. And it's arranged in the way there is it's more than a multiplication table, even though it's full of one part of it. There is a whole and whole numbers and whole and fractions. There's a table of squares in the way it's arranged, And it is each of the thing that are numbers in the NCOD are also concrete measuring things for real, right? So there is a correspondence between what you learn in the school and how did you measure for real at your and this is a table of squares. And all this happened in this institution called the Thin School, which is, which was there in the verandas of this thing. So you bring upon a locally familiar world of measures, bring it into the school, organize a way of training your cognitive capacities around it, and then it's ensured by a practice of learning, which is we call the recollective memory practice, which is done by loud recital, and you have to write while you are reciting, while listening to the word, and you are inscribing the symbol onto the sandboard and following the sound of someone else, usually the monitor, and so on. So the Thin School is a world of huge rhyme and chorus and constant writing and listening as a thing. In Tamil it's called Kai Pazhakam and Na Pazhakam, which is like practicing the finger and practicing the ear. So it's the practicing the tongue. So this kind of a facility to organize recollective memory is central by bringing upon the real world of measures into the school and making them numbers into the thing is facilitated by this thing. And this at the site of school, this constant erasure then decided the life of memory. The more you are writing on the sandboard and erasing it, writing on the sandboard and erasing it, you are producing a life of memory. And this recollection then becomes very important in the context of problem solving, which happens within the school and outside. And we find this constant calculation of quantities by relating them as proportions one with the other, and then that becomes the most dominant mode of calculation and problem solving during that period. But at the workplace, a text such as the Kanakadiharam, which kind of moves beyond the school and kind of it is simultaneously a manual of the revenue accountant, but it's also a register of problem solving of that society. So it has a huge collection of problems. It's not merely practical the way that the canonical historians want us to make it believe, that everything that is not in Sanskrit is Vyavahara, the practical, and the epitome of abstraction is always with computational astronomy and not so much in the thing. But Kanakadiharam defies that generalization, and then you dwell into the world of problem solving, that constant flow between the school and in the public. So there is a conversation and created a huge mass genre of problem solving from the thing. So this somehow, if you look at all the problems or the codified, versified, procedural, algorithmic rules that the Kanakadiharam has, something that strikes you very centrally is this constant necessity of manipulating proportions and relating them in very particular ways against each other by drawing upon the apparatus of recollecting memory, which you learn from the thing, and you mobilize that onto the thing. So there is a constant conversation between the workplace and the school, but was it always there is a question that did the school and the workplace constantly speak to each other? What do we mean by curriculum? When did it change? How do we trace this kind of one very particular unique thing that happened is that by about 1890s, the standard set of arithmetic textbooks in the whole of South India is constantly not organized in terms of addition, multiplication, subtraction, division as the 4 rules of arithmetic, but the exercises that follows at the end of each chapter is always about conversion problems. Yeah, you entered into the world of learning through the world of conversions. And this relationship that the student made with the text, with the palm leaf, and with the village, is of course very materially defined by the axis of caste. So while it is constantly defining, your access into that world of this thing, but the number, which is not so material, is soaked into the hierarchies of abstraction. So how do we make sense of it? And therefore, it makes us ask this question, does all calculation evade the concrete, or does it fold the concrete into itself, or is it merely a facade for the value which is anyway thrown at you? If the determinants of the value are abstract, are they hiding behind the calculating engine? Whereas the actual enslaved labor, which is the most concrete of all things, is constantly producing, allowing for itself to be produced as notional values. Then who owns the calculating engine? So if constant manipulation became a permanent feature of all valuation processes, then what is so concrete about numbers is the thing. It also, just to close, I thought it's important for us to draw upon some of these set of questions to today's thing. And I don't know if all of you have heard of AgriStack, which is the new initiative for digital agriculture as part of what is called the DPI, the Digital Public Infrastructure, which everything is thing. They're bringing it into agriculture, which means that there will be a Aadhaar for farmer, Aadhaar for land, and Aadhaar for crop. That's what it is. Yeah. So then you commensurate all three different Aadhaars of the crop, land, and the farmer, produce a unique register, and then in order to, the promise is to have precision agriculture, data-driven decision, digitization of all these things that you see on the right. So if that is the new kind of thing, in order to facilitate market linkages, creating new sites of exchange mediated by the digital public infrastructure, and how do we kind of unravel to the promise? What kind of questions do we ask to each of the promise? Questions of market optimization or using the AI as a tool, or so what does precision agriculture anyway mean? Is it like carrying an app in your phone and then calculate the moisture content of in the air and moisture content in your crop, and then see how much of fertilizer you are supposed to make? I mean, these are the kind of so what happens in this ecosystem is that this thing stays as concrete as it is. Yeah, this is the world that none of these people enter into the world except through the means of abstraction, right? So then you have produce this various set of calculation instruments that you can, and then all the people who are producing and using and deploying these things are interacting with this world through these instruments, and then more and more machines are introduced into the system. And so this whole new thing of the new imperial dream of pixelating all land into the thing, which is the fundamental thing, is if you pixelate all land, and is the promise. But in practice, there's this huge controversy that happened as AgriStack unraveled, is that the agriculture department staff struck work and said, look, we are not entering into this thing, we are not doing the survey. Yeah, there was a huge strike. They refused to undertake the survey, and then hurriedly, in order to kind of meet the indices of in order to make the promise this thing. So all the agriculture college students in Tamil Nadu, were asked to take their mobile phones and get into the fields and start pixelating the land and fix the geo coordinates for this thing. And there was they were not paid, they were not given accommodation. The most so within about 3 days they were trying to pixelate the whole of land and so on. So what happens to these kind of promises is, somewhere there seems to be a traffic between the finance industry and the promise of the digital public infrastructure that it makes. And so all this, what do the large corporates have to do, and where do the farmers stand? There's a whole elaborate system, and how do we kind of map the flow of valuation through this thing is something for us to think about. And somewhere in between, as the important nodes of calculation is already entering into the like startups, like for instance, there's a whole list of startups that get into this system, whereas Amazon, Google, Microsoft are given the thing to pixelate the thing. Then you have a different set of startup ecosystem that drawing upon this promise, and like most of them are about developing apps into the thing. Yeah. So, and this kind of made us wonder. Ganesh made this drawing, and he's put in a lot of effort to make us understand this thing about there is an accumulation of failed promises constantly, all the promises that and these are also the realm of needs, and that became the realm of promises, and there is a accumulation of value for undelivered promises that accumulate onto the other side. And how do we kind of the flow of promises and the flow of promises on both terms materialized into schemes and value very differently, and what kind of a promise that we have if we yield to the thing. And just to it's an invitation to think collectively about, don't we have to then reimagine a set of countermeasures? And how do we kind of not just critique or not just set of complaints about what's happening, but also to think more in a more conscious, organized manner as what can be the revisiting of the measures. So these are some of the thoughts. And so these are something that increasingly I think working women are asking, can you reduce all our work, if what is quantifiable and what is all not quantifiable, merely into the unit of 8 hours? Yeah. What if the unit of land is not in terms of a metric unit, but then what is it a proportion of all the landless that's still this thing? How can we kind of imagine land units in that way? These are some of the things that I think we thought, ask, post the question and treat it as an invitation for collective thing. But should we all then begin with a more engaged political scrutiny of the regimes of calculation that we otherwise become complicit in accepting it as a value? Thank you.
Thank you, Senthil. Any questions, thoughts?
Thank you, Senthil. That was really fantastic. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the latter half of the talk, which is, the last, the agri-stack, which is the kind of, it's the big circle, right? We start with the empire and the extraction of revenue, the revenue accountant, and then that role of the revenue accountant is mediated by fintech, it's mediated by outsourced calculus. And it's interesting to me, I wonder what you make of this, like the whole sort of system that you describe in the last 2 slides, the AgroStack slides, is really about creating a kind of dependence or the outsourcing of value that has very severe implications for water and the use of water, data centers, server storage spaces, which directly impacts. There's a very close connection then between that and the kind of access to water to which, say, Tamil Nadu is already in a fairly dire situation. So I just wondered, does that enter the measure of value, the question of water? How would it do so if we were to incorporate that? And what would the ecological do to your countermeasure paradigm?
Yeah. Thanks, Bani. So, yeah, I mean, the countermeasure needs to kind of mobilize all these things. So it's like there is a huge push towards currently monetization of salt lands in coastal parts of the thing. Yeah, so it's like it's a liability. It's like there is a thing. So how do we think of the ecological thing when we have to? What does it mean to me, and what does it mean for the investor, and what does it mean for the state, and what does it mean for the regulator who is supposed to mediate between the thing? Invariably forgets the meaning that the salt work has for the households. However oppressive it is to continue to work for 240 rupees a day of salt work, then given that ecosystem, if nothing else can be grown, so it's like in the coastal deltaic areas with the increasing salinity, people are saying in a very matter of fact way, well, if you cannot grow rice, grow shrimp. This is protein, that's protein, what's your problem? Yeah, so it's that kind of a thing without accounting for the ecological, how it sustains a particular way of life, not necessarily in defense of what remains traditional has to remain traditional all the time, but there is a possibility of reimagining that landscape and the connection that labor has to that ecology in very differently, so that all problems of environmental thing in India is not treated as labor problems, but they're treated as standalone environmental problems or ecological problems, and that is one way to begin with. If you then anchor the valuation in the household, in the unpaid labor of working women, then do we have a different apparatus of this thing is also something, as much folding in the ecological, folding in the household, standing at the threshold of the household and looking at the world differently. And that's what I think, this is just one factor in which.
Yeah, so just wondering, I don't know whether I missed it out. So when you were talking about measurement of land in terms of, and then also the measuring the fertility or access to water, for taxation purposes, is the tax itself was measured with certain kinds of rationale, or, I mean, I think in some text, you know, they say certain percentage of the produce, right? In some cases, there is really no clear understanding of on what basis you tax people.
No, thankfully in the medieval published inscriptional record, we have very fine details about what kind of taxes to be paid by what kind of land, in terms of area as well as quality. So I was discussing yesterday, it's like through various things we know that one valley of land, which is like equivalent to 6.5 acres in the modern units, is supposed to pay a tax of 300 columns of rice as the tax. So that's the topmost land. And that topmost land determined the place for every other land in the whole of the empire in terms of its tax potential. So on top of it, you have the instruments such as Madaku. Then you fold it. It's like you can consider it as, nobody should remain untaxed. Is one way of thinking about it, by providing for concessions and therefore creating privileges on the other side, but also collecting more and more this thing. But the 300 measures of rice during the imperial period at the peak of the thing seems to be the standard set of wages. But
So another one, in delta or even estuarian regions, the water bodies are owned by people. How do they measure because it doesn't make, because the product, which is basically moving across the water bodies, how do they know how much to share, and how do they measure all those things?
oh, you
How
see
did
it.
they rather?
You see, there is a tax paid on the every fishing gear. So the taxation on the instruments of employed by labor. No,
No,
so
that is for taxation. If the people have to share a large water body of a village, on what basis if they own certain piece of water body, or and then they can share the product of that?
So the idea of public infrastructure is primarily around irrigation facilities, especially because they're trying to convert everything into a wetland rice cultivation area. That's the major push of the Cholas. And it's not that there are no dryland agriculture areas around the fringes, especially along the river, beyond Kollidam and within Kollidam, that big river. That was their geographical thing. So there is a public infrastructure is usually the responsibility of the royal order, but then delegated to the local administrative body. And that is the measure of public infrastructure is in terms of labor tax. Labor tax in concrete terms means that everyone is supposed to send so many people to work, either to build a canal or to maintain a canal or to repair a canal or repair a palace or to carry the palanquin in the temple festival. And it's like, so there is two kinds of tax. One is the tax that goes to the king to be divided by the landlord and the temple, and the other tax is local, which is always in terms of labor tax. And that is the way that we know that the control over labor was absolute within the locality. So
So, if we are thinking about power as the ability to mobilize labor in an absolute or graded sense, and also the ability to mobilize capital, but I'm not leaving that aside for the moment. I'm trying to think of that situation in the 18th century when you have this huge diversity of instruments or sort of measurement, right? And I'm trying to think of how that works in terms of how workers are able to negotiate that diversity of measuring instruments and lack of standardization of that. How does that work? Now, for instance, if you've got a landless laborer who is working in a particular district which has a particular set of measuring instruments, and so therefore that becomes the measure of how land is assessed, how the produce is assessed, how the tax is assessed, how the hasil is assessed, etc. And they move to another area where there's a whole different regime of measurement. Now, one circumstance in which they would move is if there is too much exploitation in one area, then there's abandonment, etc., and you move to another area and try and restart your life. But I mean, I'm thinking, how does the diversity or the non-standardization of measurement protect or not protect workers? And then how does that then change when the colonial standardization takes place? In other words, what happens to labor in that transition?
Yeah, thanks, Hamid. And this is mostly, I think, leaving an occupation. Who has the freedom to quit from a caste occupation is one way of looking at it. If the political control over labor is through the caste apparatus, if the wage differential thing, either by the instrument or in terms of money, does not change that much. And most often, for instance, in the Vedaranyam salt lands, even today, in times of a disguise, there is a payment of annual payment to the family of salt workers as an advance credit. And then the interest that is to be paid becomes the default wage. And in fact, there is no payment at all, except for the twice payment during the Diwali and Pongal festivals of the thing. So, which is by default thing. So for a very long time, whether to leave salt work, which I think people have started this thing, the cooperatives, so all kinds of modern institutional mechanisms to kind of come and intervene into this persistent forms of injustice through the wage form is mediated by, continues to be mediated by political control through caste. So, but then we have, I think, interesting histories of, I mean, as I told yesterday, one is to resist the instrument itself and ask for a better means of thing, or we also find an interesting debate about leaving and quitting occupations and then shifting to, if not, you are not being able to rearrange the terms in which your labor is treated by the others. Then we have instances of the huge Kaikolar migration along the east coast when all the pariahs become weavers along the thing with the introduction of the thing. So we have that kind of a thing, and then entering into a different sector of the thing. So migration, quitting caste occupations is not a privilege, unfortunately, for many other caste groups, but for the pariahs, which in fact now a lot of revisiting and those kind of histories are celebrated as this thing. We have nothing to lose because we can leave behind something, whereas people who are tied to land cannot ever leave land. Yeah, so there is a discourse that's taking shape. So there are some interesting histories around. But in case Madhavan is here, he's studying in the Kuttanad area of Kerala, which became a region of rice cultivation. We discovered a measuring instrument called Kulyan, which is literally like a fistful of rice. Yeah, but the measure of labor to reclaim land, which literally means you are making land out of water. So Madhavan is studying this measure called Padivu, which is amount of, you dive into the wetland, you are literally scraping off the thing, coming up with the mud, putting it into the boat, and then putting it somewhere else, and making land out of water, like that. So you do it all the time. So the number of breaths it takes to the corresponding to the proportion of soil that you bring up is the Padivu as a measure, and then it is returned as a payment through this fistful of rice, and they have a new instrument for it. And there is human sacrifice at the beginning of the thing. There are all kinds of things. The reclamation of Kuttanad rice lands, where M.S. Swaminathan comes from, incidentally, is also the way, so there the fish that floats in the water belongs to the Pulayar women, whereas, the landlord didn't care. But so these kind of continuous entitlements that you get and that you do not get remains continuous way in which, so except for migration or quitting and leaving, to the extent that we know, so it's always a question, why do we then, continue to remain there and this thing. So which is also one of the central questions, I think, a lot of historians of caste are asking today. So there is this interesting debate in the middle of indenture, just to kind of on a parallel. So a nationalist poet like Subramanya Bharatiyar, will cry with a huge lament, oh, my Tamil labor, toiling in the islands of Haiti and nobody to care for them. It's like a cry and scream and a lament. Whereas people such as Ayotidas Pandidar, who are emerging as, intellectuals, he was saying, please leave, quit, go, where you have no nation, no caste, no this thing, so you are free, you are just your labor, your working body, and it's a contract, yeah, and then do whatever. So there is this way in which, what does it mean to quit, and what does it mean to remain, and what is the way out, despite what continues to be controlled by power, either through measure or a value or in terms of place. And I think it's possibly more important to look at those histories. And so, yeah. Yes, Hardik.
So I was just wondering how this speaks to Marx's theory of labor, and whether you see all measurement, all forms of measurement, as in some way or the other, it's a means to create surplus value which can be appropriated. Or is there something else that this actually illuminates in that?
Yeah. No, I mean, our friend Geeta has been telling us, no, please go back to Capital Volume 1 and reread it again. We're ready to do that. But I think what these questions, as I said, it comes from the questions made by Dixon and so on. So that kind of a conscious theorizing, I'm not sure. We are, this thing, but probably something for us to reflect upon. But having said that, we are also thinking like this question of this relationship between dignity and labor, if that becomes, something that is, that becomes the anchor and the beginning place for valuation thing. If you begin from there, then it poses a distinct question of what is quantifiable and what is not quantifiable. Then there is a meaning to labor, despite the surplus that it generates. If that can be traced and quantified, and then the question is also, are we then stuck with the wage form as a means of justice, yeah, or redistribution of resources, which is, so one of the pertinent questions of our times is, till about 10-15 years ago, there is supposed to be a hunger for land as a means for redistribution, right? Land reforms, give back the land that you took. So land is the means for claiming freedom. But, within a very short span of time, people are giving up on land left and right the moment at a given opportunity. If that is changing, then is the wage form parity, is a means for this thing, and then reclaiming a part of the surplus that you are getting. Is it the only way? If the calculation of wages anyway does not account for the household and paid work, which then makes possible all other forms of labor in the world, then, so we are doing this exercise with Professor Barbara Harris, who some of us are here. Like she says, pushing us into thinking through this question of where do you do quantify and where can you not quantify, the time use charts and what economists use routinely, and what is it that you need to use in order to bring the meaning of work into the unquantifiable registers, and together is there a notion of value that we can make out of it. I'm not sure if it exactly speaks to the Marxist theories of surplus value, but definitely speaks to a particular necessity for political organizing today, I think, which I think there is a necessity that trade unions or labor movements are confronted with. Is it from the workplace to the neighborhood? If you go there, and a lot of reproduction of labor and its consciousness happens over there, then if we still hold on to the conciliation process or to the minimum wages or to the thing, are we not speaking for a whole lot of other things? That is, how do we address that? It partly comes from that. Is there a way that we can bring in not necessarily only dignity questions or caste questions, but also bring in knowledge and this thing, especially in the world of skilling and reskilling that the economists talk about? How do we account for that? Is like, and this is something that I think rice workers of the Delta started asking even 20 years ago, especially younger people who started leaving the villages. It's like they consciously raised this question to the left movement, asking, why do you want us to keep tied us to the land question? Whereas the promise of owning a land and becoming an independent producer within the lifetime is becoming distant and distant and distant, then how are we then tied to the land? Why don't we just go to the city and become something else? That kind of a, so that is the, I think, crucial phase in which ideas of surplus and ideas of dignity had to speak to each other. Not that they have not spoken earlier, but I think there is a new necessity for us to revisit that question.
Okay, one last question, and then we can continue the conversation later. Tea and snacks. Yeah.
Hi, Tanya.
So yeah, tying into actually the question that you raised and which you answered in such a um, sort of expansive way, I was thinking about this idea of the countermeasure versus perhaps actually counter value, right? Because this is, yes, it is moving forward from the critique to propose something new, which is already for critical social science as a move. But perhaps, for instance, in relation to the first question on water, which is how I think about this stuff, of course, water is not considered in the calculations of agrarian political economy and this and that itself is a problem. And with groundwater salinization, etc., in the delta, the residents of the delta are trying different ways to kind of translate their embodied understanding of what is good water into the numerical scientific register, which would then grant them legitimacy. And in that sense, yes, they are already proposing countermeasures, but the burden of translation then is upon them who are already facing really the brunt of environmental change, right? So then how do you kind of take in what they value and how they measure things to form that idea of value without creating extra work for them in a way? And then also, and you already hinted to this, right? Why only dignity, but what about other things like knowledge and whatever, epistemological justice or emancipation? Like, what could be then new values and how do you get to it? And of course, I mean, this is a very vague question, but yeah, thank you.
I mean, this is exactly the questions that came to us, which pushes us further and further into be more consistent in having these conversations with, not necessarily at the sites of conflict and the sites of heightened activism and then sudden dull thing, but to how do you develop a consistent practice where you can stay in and linger, not necessarily, as we keep telling ourselves, we cannot be visiting fellows, listening to people and come back and withdraw into our zones and then reflect and go back and ask your questions further. But then, so this necessity for consistency in political practice is also probably a way to remain and engage with these questions. So because every time, like the place for water or the place for dignity or the place for this thing, I mean, they're also constantly rethinking through the thing, right? And we are not listening to most of those conversations except at the moment that we this thing in that landscape. So that's something that we think, I mean, how do you make it into an abiding practice in order to render some kind of a framework for the countermeasure or the counter value, as you said. I mean, that's what occurs to me, that it's necessary.
All right, thank you so much, Babu. Thank you everyone for joining us. This was the 73rd public lecture series from Archives at NCBS. That means we've had 72 before and we're going to have another one next month. So it's something that keeps happening every month. So keep updated with us through our social media and mailing list. And the audience, public are one of the biggest stakeholders with whatever we do at the archive. So it would be great if you can come leave your thoughts with us, or like if you have anything to tell us, anything that we can improve on, that'd be wonderful. 4 p.m. Thank you.